She slapped me across the face in front of my own children, and for 1 second, the whole room went silent, waiting to see what I would do. But to understand why my hand came up just as fast as hers did, you have to go back. You have to understand what 4 years of small humiliations does to a person before it finally cracks. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I married into a family where my mother-in-law, Linda, had run the show for 30 years, and nobody had ever told her no. Not her husband, not her son, certainly not me. My husband's name is Daniel. He's a good man in most ways. He's patient with our kids. He works hard. He never raises his voice. But when it comes to his mother, something in him just shuts off. He goes quiet. He goes small. And for 4 years, I told myself that was fine, because I could handle Linda on my own. I was wrong about that. But it took me a long time to admit it. The first time I really understood what I was dealing with was at my own wedding. I remember standing in the reception hall in my dress, feeling like the luckiest woman alive, and Linda walked up to me with a glass of wine in her hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked me up and down and said, "Well, I suppose Daniel could have done worse." Then she laughed like it was a joke. Nobody else laughed. My own mother heard it, and her face went pale. But Daniel just put his arm around me and said, "That's just how she is." Like that was supposed to make it hurt less. That should have told me everything. But when you're 26 and in love, and the band is playing and everyone's clapping, you convince yourself you misheard. You convince yourself it'll get better once she gets to know you. It didn't get better. It just got quieter. And quieter is worse, because quiet humiliation is the kind you can't point to. It's the kind that makes you sound crazy when you try to explain it to someone who wasn't in the room. For the first year of our marriage, it was little things. Linda would host Sunday dinners, and I noticed I was always served last, after Daniel, after his father, after his brother's wife, even after the kids once they were old enough to sit at the table. If I mentioned it, she'd say I was being sensitive. If I let it go, she'd do it again the next week. It wasn't about food. It was about where I stood in that house, and she wanted to make sure I never forgot it. Then the kids came. First my daughter, then 2 years later my son. And that's when it stopped being about me and started being about them, which is a different kind of pain entirely, because you can absorb an insult aimed at yourself. You cannot absorb one aimed at your children. Linda had opinions about everything: how I fed them, how I disciplined them, how I dressed them for winter, how I let them talk, how much screen time was too much. And she didn't offer these opinions privately. She offered them at the table, in front of everyone, in that same syrupy tone she used at my wedding, the one that let her say cruel things and call them concern. "You know, in my day, we didn't let children speak over adults," she said once, when my 4-year-old daughter interrupted to ask for more juice. I opened my mouth to say something, but Daniel put his hand on my knee under the table, a silent, "Please don't." So I didn't. I swallowed it, like I swallowed everything else, and I told myself I was doing it for peace. But peace built on swallowing your own voice isn't peace. It's just quiet war, and you're the only one losing ground. I want to be fair to Daniel here, because this isn't a story about a villain and a victim. Not entirely. Daniel loved me. He still does. But he grew up in that house, under that woman, and by the time I met him, he had learned exactly one way to survive her: agree, deflect, disappear into the background until the storm passed. He didn't know how to stand up to her, because he had never once seen anyone do it and survive intact. His father certainly hadn't. His father had spent 3 decades nodding along, and Daniel had inherited that nod like a family heirloom. So when Linda corrected my parenting, Daniel went quiet. When she made her little comments about my cooking, my job, my weight after each pregnancy, Daniel changed the subject instead of defending me. He would apologize to me later, in private, in our bedroom with the door closed. "I know she's a lot," he'd say. "I'll talk to her." But he never did. And I started to understand that his apologies were just another way of avoiding the actual conflict. He could feel bad for me without ever having to be brave for me. Those are 2 very different things, and it took me embarrassingly long to see the difference. By the time my son turned 6, I had built an entire internal system for surviving Linda. I picked my battles. I let the small things go so I'd have energy for the things that actually mattered. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself I was the bigger person. But really, I was just exhausted, and exhausted people make peace with almost anything if it means one less fight. Then came the dinner that was supposed to be nothing, just a regular Sunday, the kind we'd had 100 times before. Daniel's brother and his wife were coming too, along with their own 2 kids, so the house was going to be full. Linda had been texting me all week about the menu, about what I should bring, about whether my son was still a picky eater, needling in that particular way she had, of asking questions that were really just criticisms wearing a question mark. I remember reading one of her texts in the school pickup line and feeling this tightness in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like dread, the kind you get before a storm, when the air pressure changes and your body knows something before your mind catches up. I almost said something to Daniel that week. I remember sitting across from him at our own kitchen table, watching him eat, and thinking, I need him to understand that something in me is running out. But I didn't say it. I told myself it wasn't the right moment, that I didn't want to start a fight before we even got to his mother's house. So instead, I just said, I hope Sunday goes smoothly. And he said, it will, don't worry. And that was the end of it. Neither of us knew how wrong he was. Looking back now, I think some part of me already sensed that Sunday was going to be different. Call it instinct, call it 4 years of pattern recognition, but as I got the kids dressed that morning, buttoning my son's collared shirt because Linda liked the kids to look presentable, I felt that same tightness in my chest again, sharper this time. My daughter asked me why I looked nervous, and I told her I wasn't, which was a lie, because mothers lie to their children about fear all the time, thinking it protects them. It doesn't. Kids feel it anyway. They just don't have the words for it yet. We pulled into Linda's driveway at exactly 1 o'clock, the time she'd specified 3 separate times that week. I remember sitting in the car for a moment after Daniel turned off the engine, my hands still on my lap, my daughter unbuckling her seatbelt behind me, my son already reaching for the door handle. I remember thinking, just get through today. Just get through today like you've gotten through every other day. I had no idea that by the time we left that house, everything about the way I got through days was going to change. The house smelled like roast chicken and rosemary when we walked in, the way it always did on Sundays, and for a moment, everything felt almost normal. Linda greeted the kids first, the way she always did, bending down to hug my daughter and telling my son how tall he'd gotten. Then she looked at me, gave me the kind of hug where only your shoulders touch, and said, "You made it. I wasn't sure you'd be on time." It was 1 o'clock exactly. But that was Linda's way, always planting a small flag of criticism before you'd even taken your coat off, so you spent the rest of the visit trying to make up for something you never actually did wrong. Daniel's brother Mark and his wife Christine were already there with their 2 kids, and for a while it really did feel like an ordinary Sunday. The kids ran off to the playroom. The adults sat in the living room with drinks. Linda's husband, Daniel's father, was in his usual chair by the window, mostly quiet, the way he'd been for as long as I'd known him. I remember thinking, maybe today really will be fine, but dinners at that house had a rhythm to them, and the calm at the start was never a promise. It was just the part before the part that mattered. When Linda called everyone to the table, there was the usual scramble of chairs and kids arguing about who sat next to whom. I ended up at the far end, near the kitchen doorway, which had become my unofficial seat over the years, close enough to help serve, far enough to not really be part of the center of things. Linda began plating the chicken herself, the way she always did, starting with Daniel's father, then Mark, then Christine, then the grandchildren, one by one, working her way around the table with this practiced, deliberate order. I watched my son's plate get filled, then my daughter's, then everyone else's. I was last again. I always was. Normally, I would have let it go. I want to be honest about that. Normally, I would have smiled and said thank you when my plate finally came and told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But something in me that day had already been worn down to almost nothing, and I noticed that my son, my 6-year-old, had noticed too. He looked at his own plate, then at mine, still empty, and he said, in that innocent way kids have of saying the thing adults are too careful to say. "Mommy, why do you always go last?" The table went a little quiet. Linda's serving spoon paused in the air for half a second, and I felt something in my chest that wasn't dread this time. It was something closer to clarity. "That's a good question," I said, keeping my voice light, keeping it calm, the way I'd learned to do over the years. "I'm not sure. Grandma, would you mind if I went earlier next time? I think it would mean a lot to the kids to see that everyone gets treated the same. I want to be clear that this was not an attack." I said it gently. I said it with a small smile. I said it the way you'd say almost anything to keep a Sunday dinner pleasant. But Linda's face changed the moment the words left my mouth, and I understood, too late, that in her house, a request like that wasn't received as a request. It was received as a challenge to 30 years of an order she had built and never once had questioned. "Excuse me?" she said, setting the spoon down. "I just meant—" I started. "I know exactly what you meant," she said, and her voice had that edge to it now, the one I'd heard aimed at other people over the years, but never quite like this. Never quite at me. Not at the table. Not in front of everyone. "You're saying I play favorites in my own home." "That's not what I said," I said, and I could feel my own voice starting to shake, not from fear, but from the effort of staying calm, while something old and tired in me strained against its leash. "You've always thought you were better than this family," Linda said, and now she was standing, her chair scraping back against the floor. "Coming into my son's life, telling me how to run my own table." "Mom," Daniel said, finally, weakly. She didn't say that, but it was too late. Linda had already come around the table, and before I understood what was happening, her hand connected with my face, hard enough that my head turned with it, hard enough that for a second there was just white noise and the sting spreading across my cheek. I heard my daughter gasp. I heard my son start to cry. And in that silence that followed, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on a room, I understood something with total clarity for the first time in 4 years. I was not going to swallow this one. I don't remember deciding to do it. I remember my hand moving before my mind had fully caught up, the same way hers had. It connected with her cheek, not as hard as hers had hit me, but hard enough that the sound of it seemed to echo off every wall in that dining room. Linda's hand flew to her face, her eyes wide with a shock I had genuinely never seen on her before, because I don't think in 30 years anyone in that house had ever hit her back. I don't think anyone had ever hit her back about anything. The room stayed frozen for what felt like a very long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Mark's fork was still in his hand, halfway to his mouth. Christine had one arm instinctively around her own daughter. Daniel's father hadn't moved from his chair at all, his eyes fixed on his plate like if he didn't look up, none of this would be real. And Daniel was staring at me, then at his mother, then back at me, his mouth slightly open, saying nothing, doing nothing, exactly the way he had done nothing for 4 years. That was the moment that mattered more than the slap itself, if I'm honest. Not Linda's hand on my face, not my hand on hers. It was watching my husband sit there in his chair, frozen, while our children cried, and understanding in that instant that he was never going to be the one to fix this. He was never going to stand up first. If anyone was going to protect our kids from ever having to watch a scene like this again, it was going to have to be me. "We're leaving," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. Linda started to say something, some mix of outrage and disbelief, but I wasn't listening anymore. I walked around the table to my daughter, who was still crying quietly, and I picked her up even though she was really getting too big for it, because right then, she needed to be held more than she needed to be independent. I told my son to get his shoes. He didn't argue. He just ran to the front hall and started pulling them on with shaking hands, the way kids do when they understand something serious has happened, even if they don't have the words for what. Daniel finally found his voice as I was walking toward the door. "Wait, can we talk about this?" "Not here," I said. "Not today." I didn't wait to see if he was coming. I buckled my daughter into her car seat, my hands moving on autopilot while my face still throbbed faintly where Linda had hit me. and my son climbed in beside her, silent, watching me with an expression that was older than 6 years old should ever have to wear. Daniel got in a moment later, in the passenger seat, not the driver's seat, because I was the one who started the car, I was the one who backed out of that driveway, and I was the one who decided, somewhere between his mother's house and our own, that I was done asking permission to be treated with basic respect. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes of the drive. I could hear my daughter sniffling in the back seat, my son's hand reaching over at some point to hold hers, the two of them comforting each other in a way that broke something open in my chest all over again. Daniel finally said, quietly, "I'm sorry. I should have said something back there." "You should have said something 4 years ago," I said. I wasn't yelling. I didn't have it in me to yell. I just said it plainly, like a fact, because that's what it was. He didn't answer. There wasn't really an answer to give. By the time we pulled into our own driveway, the adrenaline that had carried me through the last 20 minutes was starting to fade, and what was left underneath it wasn't anger anymore. It was something quieter and heavier. I sat in the car for a moment after I put it in park, looking at our house, our normal, ordinary house, and I understood that nothing about our family was going to be able to go back to exactly what it was before. I didn't know yet what it was going to become instead. I only knew that whatever came next, I wasn't going back to being the woman who went last. That night, after the kids were finally asleep, I sat on the edge of our bed and looked at myself in the mirror on the closet door. There was a faint redness on my cheek, already fading, but I kept looking at it anyway, because I think some part of me needed to confirm that it had really happened, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Daniel sat on the other side of the bed, not saying anything for a long time. Finally, he said, "I don't know what to do." "I'm not asking you to know what to do," I said. "I'm asking you to decide something. Not tonight, but soon, because I can't keep doing what we've been doing." I want to be honest about what the days after that dinner actually looked like, because it wasn't clean, and it wasn't fast. There was no dramatic speech where Daniel suddenly transformed into a man who stood up to his mother overnight. There was, instead, a lot of silence. A lot of him staring at his phone, not answering it, because Linda had apparently called him 11 times the day after the dinner and texted him a message that, from what he told me, was less an apology and more a demand that I apologize to her. I didn't apologize. I want to say that clearly, because I know some people hearing this story will wonder if I softened afterward, if I found some way to smooth it over, the way I'd smoothed over everything else for 4 years. I didn't. I couldn't. Something in me had changed permanently at that table, and I wasn't interested in going backward. For the first week, Daniel tried to stay neutral, which is its own kind of choice, even if he didn't want to see it that way. He didn't defend his mother to me, but he also didn't call her out for what she'd done. He just existed in this uncomfortable middle space, hoping, I think, that if he waited long enough, the whole thing would blow over the way disagreements in his family always had. But I wasn't willing to let it blow over this time, and that was new for both of us. About 10 days after the dinner, I sat him down and told him what I needed, not as an ultimatum wrapped in anger, but as something calm and final. I told him I loved him, and I loved our life together, but that I would not bring our children back into a house where they watched their grandmother hit their mother, not until there was a real conversation, a real accountability, something more than silence. I told him that his job wasn't to fix his mother. It was to decide, finally, after all these years, whose side he was actually on when it mattered. Not in a dramatic, storybook way, just in the ordinary, daily way of a man choosing to speak up the next time his mother crossed a line, instead of putting his hand on my knee under the table. I think that conversation was harder for him than the slap itself had been for me, in its own way, because it forced him to look at something he'd spent 30 years avoiding. To his credit, and I want to give him this credit because it matters, he didn't disappear into denial. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He sat with it, and a few days later, he drove to his mother's house alone, without me, without the kids, and had a conversation I wasn't part of and don't know all the details of, except for what he told me afterward, which was that he had finally told her the truth, that what she did was not acceptable. That if she wanted any relationship with her grandchildren going forward, It would be on different terms than the ones she'd operated under for 30 years. Linda did not take it well, from what he described. There was anger. There was denial. There was the classic protest that she was only ever trying to help. But something had shifted, because for the first time in his life, Daniel didn't back down. He told her that until she was willing to apologize, genuinely, not as a formality but as something she meant, we would not be coming back. And he meant it enough that when she didn't apologize that day, he left anyway. It took nearly 2 months before Linda reached out again, and when she did, it wasn't the syrupy performance I'd grown so used to over the years. It was a short message, almost stiff with the effort it clearly took her, saying she was sorry for what happened at dinner and that she would like to try again, differently. I won't pretend that message undid 4 years of small humiliations, because it didn't. And I won't pretend our relationship became warm overnight, because it hasn't. But it was a start, and more importantly, it was proof that something had actually changed, not just in her, but in the whole structure of how our family operated. The bigger change, the one that mattered most to me, was in Daniel. In the months that followed, I watched him become someone who spoke up in small moments, the kind of moments that used to pass by unnoticed. When his mother made an offhand comment about our daughter's clothing choices at a birthday party a few months later, Daniel was the one who said, gently but clearly, "Let's not do that, Mom." When she tried to reorganize our son's bedtime routine during a sleepover without asking us first, Daniel was the one who called her and set the boundary himself, without me having to ask him to. It wasn't perfect. He still had moments of old habits creeping back in, moments where I could see him bite his tongue out of instinct. But the difference was that now, when I noticed it, I could say something and he would actually hear it, instead of shutting the conversation down the way he used to. I think about my wedding day sometimes, about Linda's comment as she looked me up and down with that wine glass in her hand. Well, I suppose Daniel could have done worse. I understand now that the moment mattered less for what she said, and more for what happened right after. Daniel putting his arm around me and telling me that's just how she is, teaching me, without either of us realizing it, that the price of peace in that family was my own silence. It took 4 years and a slap across the face at a Sunday dinner table for both of us to understand that peace built that way was never really peace at all. We still see Linda now, on different terms. Dinners happen less often, and when they do, I am never served last, not because she remembers on her own every time, but because Daniel makes sure of it, quietly, without a scene, just by handing me a plate first, if hers slips back into old patterns. My son, who is 7 now, doesn't ask anymore why I go last, because I don't. My daughter, who is 9, told me a few months ago, out of nowhere, while we were doing dishes together, that she was proud of me for standing up for myself that day. I didn't know she'd understood what happened well enough to carry that with her, but kids notice more than we think, and they remember exactly the moments we assume they'll forget. I think about that dinner often, not with anger anymore, but with a strange kind of gratitude, which surprised me the first time I felt it, because for 4 years, I mistook silence for strength. I thought that absorbing insult after insult made me the stronger person in the room, the more mature one, the peacekeeper. But real strength wasn't in what I absorbed. It was in the moment my hand came up as fast as hers had, not out of rage, but because some deep, tired part of me had finally decided that I was done going last, in every sense of that phrase. My mother-in-law slapped me for speaking up that day. But what she never expected, what none of them expected, was that the woman who had spent 4 years staying quiet for the sake of peace had a limit after all. And once she found it, she was never going to go back to being the version of herself who didn't know where it was.